Donald Trump threatened Venezuela and then he pulled the trigger. He threatened Iran and then he pulled the trigger. Now he has another nation in his sights, Cuba. This is what he was saying recently to a group of Latin American leaders.
Many of you have come today and they say, I hope you can take care of Cuba because you've had problems with Cuba, right? You mentioned 4 of you said, actually, could you do us a favor? Take care of Cuba. I'll take care of it, okay?
And then a few days later came this.
It may be a friendly takeover. It may not be a friendly takeover. It wouldn't matter because they're down to, as they say, fumes. They have no energy. They have no money. They're in deep trouble on a humanitarian basis.
What does Donald Trump actually have in mind then for Cuba? What is going to happen and how quickly might it happen? Welcome to Americast.
Americast from BBC News.
Hello, it's Justin in the worldwide headquarters of Americast in London, England.
And it's Anthony in the BBC Bureau in Washington, D.C.
And we're going to talk about Cuba today, Anthony, not just because it's a fascinating place and a place lots of people have an affection for and an interest in, but also because it does appear, as we've just been hearing, it does appear, doesn't it, as if Donald Trump has plans for Cuba and plans in the relatively short term.
Yeah, as we heard in those clips earlier, I mean, Donald Trump is talking about his plans for Cuba. It's no secret that he has been pivoting American foreign policy to the Western Hemisphere and views Cuba as an important piece of reasserting American control over its geographic region. So it is the next step, the next season of Donald Trump's foreign policy excursions, as he calls them. So I think we can expect Cuba to be in the news, not just now, but even more so going forward.
And the key to the pressure on Cuba is oil, isn't it? So they used to get all their oil, or lots of their oil, from what was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union then collapsed. There were various difficulties that the Cubans went through getting more oil, but they've managed to have a pretty firm source of supply in Venezuela. We know what's happened in Venezuela. Venezuela pretty much cut off, completely cut off, actually, isn't it, since the US effective takeover of Venezuela and certainly of its ability to import and export as it sees fit. So, and we were hearing this, weren't we, on a pod we did recently, specifically on the subject of oil in Venezuela. If you don't have the oil in these nations, you do not have the electricity. So it's not just the fact that the oil's been cut off, Anthony. It's the electricity and just the way in which day-to-day life in any nation depends on electricity. And that is what the Cubans are short of.
Right. Cuba's an island, and they don't have oil wells on their island. So they need to import all of their fossil fuels. And as you mentioned, Venezuela was a key supplier for them. The United States earlier this year imposed a sweeping energy embargo on Cuba that prevented anyone, including, say, Mexico and other nations, not just Venezuela, from exporting oil into Cuba. They've made some exceptions for private businesses, but the vast majority of the oil imports were going to the state and going to power generation. And without that, as you mentioned, there's no power. They've had rolling blackouts, some that have lasted more than a day. And the people in Cuba are having to adapt to this lack of energy supplies.
And when you say having to adjust and adapt, what do we know about how difficult life is in Cuba at the moment? Because it's one of those things, isn't it? It is possible. Holidaymakers still go there, though I think probably not in the numbers that used to. There is still an ability of the outside world to get into Cuba, but the stories that you hear about it are pretty grim, aren't they? Particularly when it comes to blackouts and rubbish and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, the economy is grinding to a halt because without oil to power agriculture, for instance, without it to pay for transport, the entire country will shut down. And so I believe it is a dire situation there. Not one that they aren't able to handle. They've been in these sorts of situations before, I suppose, but it is still a really pressing concern for them, and a change from the vast supplies of oil they were getting from Venezuela just last year.
You say they've been in this situation before. It's interesting, isn't it? They've been a thorn in the side of the United States, and president after president after president after president. I mean, going back decades and decades and decades, and you think of the Bay and Pigs and all the rest of it at the beginning of the 1960s, and yet they've always managed somehow to keep going. And so this is a big moment, isn't it? If the loss of the Venezuelan oil essentially seems to be potentially, are we saying, the thing that does for them?
It could be. They've had remarkable staying power, like you say. I mean, they have been around despite their proximity to the United States, just 90 miles, I believe, from one part of Cuba to the U.S. state of Florida. But it is still one of these holdouts, one of these relics of the Cold War, like North Korea, that is still kind of exists the way it had even during the height of the Cold War. The fact that this nation has been able to persevere, and this family, the Castro family, has been able to keep control of this island for going on upwards of 80 years is a fairly remarkable achievement. But you're right, this could be the moment. And I think there are people in the Trump administration, particularly Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, who is the child of Cuban immigrants, who see this as a generational opportunity to change that and to make Cuba more a part of America's orbit in a way that it was prior to the Castro revolution.
Yeah, and it's so tantalizing, isn't it? Because, as you say, it is incredibly close. And I remember when there were rumors about Fidel's death. This is before he died, but there were rumors about it. I remember going down to Miami with BBC colleagues and doing deals with people to buy space on their speedboats because they were going to, these are wealthy emigres, they were going to, the moment his death was announced, I can remember doing this deal. I don't think any money actually changed hands, but there was talk of quite big payments to get us, news crews, onto the boats, which would sort of hurtle across that waterway and put us into Havana within a couple of hours. And the expectation was, wasn't it, that as soon as Fidel went, the whole thing would be over, and it wasn't. It just didn't happen.
Right. I had a friend who was very anti-Castro, who had a cigar he was ready to smoke when Fidel died, and he smoked it, but the country didn't change. Raúl took over. Raúl is still, in theory, running the country, although I think it's members of his extended family now because he's quite old. But they have managed to persevere in the face of, as you mentioned, continued pressure by the United States in different levels, depending on different presidents. Some have tried to put the pressure on more. Some have tried to find new diplomatic ways. Obviously, Barack Obama and what he did in 2016 was the notable American outreach to Cuba, and it felt like things might be on the verge of changing there. But then Donald Trump came back in and changed course again and upped the pressure on Cuba. Biden didn't really touch it, I don't think, not as much after what Trump did in his first term. But now here we are, Trump's back, and it is maximum pressure once again. And this time it's maximum pressure with the precedent that we see now in Venezuela and now in Iran. I mean, that is a very different place now than we were in the past in dealing with Cuba, I think.
Well, let's hear a bit more about what Donald Trump is saying at the moment about Cuba and about what ought to happen there.
So, and as these situations in Venezuela and Cuba should make clear under our new doctrine, and it is a doctrine, we will not allow hostile foreign influence to gain a foothold in this hemisphere. That includes the Panama Canal, which we talked about. We're not going to allow it. As we achieve a historic transformation in Venezuela, we're also looking forward to the great change that will soon be coming to Cuba. Cuba's at the end of the line. They're very much at the end of the line. They have no money. They have no oil. They have a bad philosophy. They have a bad regime that's been bad for a long time.
You said that Cuba wants to make a deal.
Yes.
What would the United States get in return for that, and why should Americans trust Marco Rubio to negotiate it?
Well, Marco Rubio is doing a great job. I think he's going to go down as the greatest Secretary of State in history. Look at what we've done as a presidency. Look at what we've done as an administration. They trust Marco, and so do the American people trust. He's been successful no matter where he's been. He also speaks the language, which is always nice and always helpful. But he's dealing, and it may be a friendly takeover. It may not be a friendly takeover. It wouldn't matter because they're down to, as they say, fumes. They have no energy. They have no money. They're in deep trouble on a humanitarian basis. And we don't want to see that, but they were very, very bad to a lot of people, as you know, and a lot of people living the Cuban American vote, which I got at record levels.
So, Anthony, when we hear all of that, does a game plan emerge to you?
I don't know. I mean, what he said there at the top about a doctrine and focusing on the Western Hemisphere and tying it into Venezuela and to Panama. We've heard that before, and we've talked about it before on this podcast. Now, the idea is that if this is the point where Cuba is desperate, it's been cut off from any allies. The Soviet Union is long gone. Now Venezuela is gone. It is truly alone, and they're going to be coming to the United States begging for a deal, in his view. And I think the goal here is to make life as difficult for Cuba as possible, and then they will eventually relent, whether that's a reality or not. Cubans have, as we've discussed, have been very determined in the past, but maybe this time finally is different.
Yeah, and finally with Marco Rubio, because of his background, and as Trump says, he speaks the language. So that's not in itself enough, but of course it's more than that. He's of Cuban heritage, and you wonder, does that give him potentially a kind of deeper sensitivity to all of this than Donald Trump is interested in having?
I think it definitely has put Cuba higher up on the priority list than it would have been. Donald Trump's, as we have discussed before, his kind of views of the world were formed in the 70s and 80s and the kind of the Cold War and anti-communism. So I'm sure Cuba was on his radar, and he understands how important Cuba has been in American foreign policy and how frustrating U.S.-Cuba relations have been for American presidents in the past. So I think he's aware of it that way. But having Marco Rubio, who came up in South Florida, was involved in Florida politics before he joined the national stage. He was a foreign policy hawk, particularly on Cuba. I think having him as the point person on this, I think that sharpens it a bit. And I think that gives Donald Trump's kind of instincts more focus here. So I think you could make the case that the move against Venezuela, the reorientation of American foreign policy towards the Western Hemisphere, all of that is kind of directed towards what is the ultimate goal, which is flipping Cuba away from as a rebel country and making it part of the American sphere once again.
And of course, the central claim Donald Trump is making now, they want to make a deal so badly you have no idea. In other words, there are people there who are being talked to and who could now be persuaded that they need to take a different course. That is very much the Trump line, isn't it? And on that, we've had this voice note, which I think is fascinating. It's a voice note from an Americaster, and an Americaster in a particularly important place, given this conversation.
Hi, I'm Juan Carlos in Havana, Cuba. Well, President Trump is always saying we are talking, we are in conversations with Cuba, but with who? Where? What are these conversations about? Because nothing is said here about having talks with the U.S. government. So what is the president talking about?
Well, we got just the person to answer that, because Peter Kornbluh is in the DC branch office of Americast. He knows a lot about those secret talks that have been taking place, or perhaps they haven't, through the decades between DC and Havana. Peter is co-author of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana. He's also a senior analyst at the National Security Archive. Peter, hi.
Good morning. It's nice to see you.
Well, it's very nice to talk to you. Answer that question, Juan Carlos's question. What is going on? What are the conversations that are happening, and what are they about?
What is happening right now is that they are talking to high-ranking Cubans. Those talks have been categorized as conversations and not necessarily negotiations. But I think that's quite semantical, really, just semantics. And the fact is that there's a back-channel dialogue going on between the Trump White House, Marco Rubio and his office, and relatives and people around Raul Castro, the historic, only surviving leader, really, of the Cuban Revolution. His son has been identified for some talks, and his grandson, Raulito, also known as El Congrejo because he has a broken finger, has also been reportedly in talks with Rubio and Rubio's office.
What are they being offered? I mean, what's in it for them?
You know, the contours of any deal, which is Donald Trump's favorite word, are just starting to emerge. If you listen closely to Marco Rubio, he has more than once actually been asked about what the United States wants from Cuba, and he's actually given what I would consider a somewhat moderate response. Cuba needs to modernize its economy, get the Communist Party out of centralized control over investment, allow foreign investment, etc. It's not going to happen overnight, Rubio has said. It's not going to be immediate regime change, an evolution rather, politically. So the focus has been on the U.S. side, has been kind of a Trump-style transactional approach of pushing for opening Cuba up to U.S. interests, U.S. business interests, and U.S. investment, pushing out all the other investors and who have interests in Cuba, like China and Russia, and basically, turning Cuba once again into a country completely dependent on U.S. support, U.S. economic control. What does Cuba get out of it? It's what Cuba doesn't get out of it. Cuba doesn't get attacked. Cuba doesn't have the U.S. military occupying its shores. Cuba doesn't have its leadership assassinated or its leadership captured, seized by U.S. Special Forces. So in some ways, he has Cuba under a vice grip. He has cut off all oil shipments to Cuba, to the Cuban state. He cut off Venezuela's oil shipments to Cuba, and then he threatened all other oil suppliers not to send tankers to Cuba, and so far none of them have. So Cuba is facing a kind of a coercive situation in which Trump is demanding their economic capitulation, at least, forcing them to the negotiating table.
So you travel to Cuba fairly regularly. You were just there, 10 days ago? You talk about the oil embargo. How is that affecting Cuban life right now?
You go to Cuba now, you don't see any cars really on the streets. More and more people are riding bicycles. There's tricycles, these kind of three-wheeled contraptions. Some of them are electric, more electric scooters for youth. It's becoming reminiscent of the special period after the collapse of the Soviet Union when there was no oil like now. Cars were completely off the street, and the Chinese came in and built a bicycle factory, and Cubans were riding 1 million bicycles. Cuba has not arrived at that point yet, but it's certainly heading towards that point. And, you see a kind of a step-by-step turning off the lights. So it's a progressive squeezing, suffocation of the Cuban economy.
So it's interesting. They've been through something like this before, and the regime has survived it. The mood of the Cuban people still supportive of the regime?
I would not say that. I think that one can honestly say that the Cuban people are exhausted by the shortages, the deprivation, the blackouts of electricity, which they've endured, frankly, now for the last 5, 6, 7 years. There's been a growing humanitarian crisis, particularly since the pandemic, when Cuba had to shut down completely its tourism industry, just like every other country. And then, of course, there's the fact that Trump has been imposing sanctions on Cuba since his first administration, and there's been tremendous mismanagement by the Communist Party government of the Cuban economy.
Back in the day, I was based in D.C., Peter, back in the period before Obama came to power. And I used to go down to Little Havana in Miami and talk to people there. And there was this fierce aggression towards Castro, the first Castro, as it was back in those days, and sense that a terrible wrong had been done to emigres who were forced to come to the United States, and they were still angry about it, and their property had been stolen, etc., etc. That over time has changed, hasn't it? I mean, a modern Cuban American may well never have been there, almost certainly hasn't been there because he or she was born in the United States. I just wonder what the politics of this is now.
It did seem to have changed generationally at the time when Obama was president. Nowadays, once again, Miami is represented by very hardline anti-Castro Cubans who really don't want to see some kind of deal get made that leaves any remnants of the old regime intact, as was the case in Venezuela. But the difference today is that Florida is no longer really a swing state in presidential elections.
That's interesting, isn't it?
But more important, Donald Trump is not going to be running for president again, and so he really is immune to the kind of political pressures that hardline anti-Castro Cuban American communities in Florida have brought on various decision making, and that's in part why you see Trump, openly talking about having these communications with Cuba. In the old days, dialogue with Cuba would be ultra sensitive and kept ultra secret. It would be the president of the United States would never openly say we're in talks with the Cubans, because he wouldn't want the hardline Cuban American community to start screaming and pushing and sabotaging those talks. But Trump is immune to those political pressures, and he wants to take credit for bringing Cuba to the table, coercing them to really bend the knee, as what he's hoping they will do. And so he's talking about it openly. The Cubans on the other side are maintaining discretion and basically saying that they're not in talks with the United States. But in fact, there are communications going on.
Peter, why didn't the Obama outreach work? Because it was a big deal, wasn't it? It was, when was it, 2016 or so? The sudden announcement that seemed to those of us outside the United States to come from virtually nowhere, and there was going to be normalization and all the rest of it. What happened?
Well, I'll tell you exactly what happened. That breakthrough was 12 years ago, and in fact, next week is the 10th anniversary of Obama's famous trip to Havana, the first sitting president to make a state visit to Cuba. That trip was intended to create momentum for the breakthrough, the rapprochement that Obama had organized with Raul Castro through secret diplomacy that took place over the course of 2 years. And that breakthrough was quite significant. The United States would normalize economic relations, we'd normalize diplomatic relations. Cuba would let the private sector grow. The United States would start to make investments, et cetera. Obama's approach really had the same goal as Trump's, to open up Cuba, bring changes eventually over the long term to its political system. But Obama was quite willing to use positive engagement, is what it was called, with the Cubans. He was willing to use the carrots, whereas Trump is all into just the sticks, using the tone of U.S. domination in the region to compel Cuba to comply. And Trump started to roll back every single initiative that Obama had made around the world. He started to impose new maximum pressure sanctions against Cuba, put Cuba back on the terrorism list, which restricted its ability to do international banking and other normal economic functions, and imposed these very, very difficult sanctions that have contributed significantly to the humanitarian crisis that Cuba faces today.
So do sticks work then? Are they going to work with Donald Trump when he's threatening them like this?
Well, they may end up working in the short term. Cuba's in a very vulnerable place right now. Fidel Castro is no longer alive. The Cuban Revolution's heyday is long past, obviously. There is not popular support today for the regime that is in place. But Cuba has a long history going back way before the Cold War, all the way to the turn of the 20th century, quest for independence and sovereignty.
How much was that move against Venezuela done with Cuba in mind? Was that the end goal all along, or as some have speculated?
Well, my colleague William Leogrand and I certainly made that argument last November, 2 months before the invasion of Venezuela, that Trump and Rubio's focus on Venezuela was a stepping stone to the trophy of the Cold War, rolling back the Cuban Revolution. But Cuba has been a goal, and the Western Hemisphere is, for the most part, the long-standing historic kind of sphere of influence, or sphere of intimidation, better put, for U.S. presidents, going all the way back to the 1800s. And Cuba is the one symbol of opposition, rebellion, revolution against U.S. interests that has stood the test of time and has survived all the attempts, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the assassination plots, the 60-plus-year-old U.S. embargo against Cuba. And so to finally be the president that rolls back the Cuban Revolution and ends the Cuban Revolution is something that I think Donald Trump wants to claim for history.
I suppose if you're in the White House, though, you might say, well, look at what's happened in Venezuela. A lot of political prisoners being kept in terrible conditions just for expressing their opinions have been let out. That happened to an extent, didn't it, in Cuba as well, when the United States began to do its talking, and there are still political prisoners in Cuba. And these are people who haven't been violent, people who just want to express themselves and are in jail. So, I mean, there are groups of people who would enormously benefit, wouldn't they? Whatever we think of Donald Trump and whatever you think of him and his commitment to democracy and all the rest of it. And I'm not suggesting for a minute that he is acting on behalf of people who are in jail for their beliefs. But one thing that could happen as a result is that a lot of people in Cuba who have been jailed and who shouldn't be in jail will be out.
Well, you know, the truth be told, there was a significant release of political prisoners that was negotiated by the Biden administration with the help of the Vatican at the very last few weeks of Biden's tenure in office. Cuba agreed to release the political prisoners, over 500 of them. Biden agreed to take Cuba off the terrorism list where there's no evidence that they should be placed there. Trump came into office a week later, and the very first day of his presidency, he put Cuba back on the terrorism list. Cuba went ahead and released the rest of those political prisoners anyway. There still are political prisoners in Cuba. Trump has not said a word about that being a goal or democracy being a goal. So we'll see what happens. But I think that it's going to be a very dramatic time. Trump is going to demand changes in the leadership at the very top. Those concessions are going to be very hard to make. Kind of the last dignified representation of the revolution is Cuba's control of its own future, and to have the United States in the form of Donald Trump dictating what that future should be is a very bitter pill for the Cuban leadership to swallow. Fascinating stuff.
Peter Kornbluh, thank you so much for talking to us.
It's a pleasure, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to talk again as this drama plays out.
Yes, it certainly feels like it, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed.
Remember, you can hear all of our other episodes wherever you get your podcasts. For now, though, from us, bye-bye.